Welcome to Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'm Tim Durling, and on this episode, I'm going through top 10 debut albums from the 1970s that I happen to have on vinyl. Now, these aren't necessarily my top 10 favorites, but they're 10 good albums that I have on vinyl, debut albums from the 1970s. A lot of my favorite bands that came in the 70s, their first albums weren't necessarily favorites of mine, which I think is cool because they had time to develop and get better. I'm going to do a follow-up episode, same thing, but with the 1980s, and a lot of 1980s debut albums are sort of fully formed, and therefore it's hard to keep up the momentum. So these aren't any particular order of preference. I just decided to do them in chronological order just to give you some ideas. So we'll start in 1973 with the debut Queen album. Self-titled, as most first albums are, and that's a drawing of Freddie Mercury on stage. This is a Canadian edition, and I don't think this is an original pressing because it's in fairly good shape. I also don't know if it came with an original lyric sleeve. I've just got a white sleeve on this one, and it was the Elektra logo that they were using at the time, the butterfly on it. And a good album, Keep Yourself Alive is on this, Liar, an early instrumental version of Seven Seas of Rhye, which they would make into a full song on Queen 2. Probably their most, I will say, progressive album. You don't think of Queen as being progressive, but there's a lot of epic sounding songs on here. No real hits that most people would recognize, but an amazing start to an amazing career. Next one I'm going to show you, also from 1973, the first Aerosmith album. Now, you may have seen this album with a slightly different cover because there is a later pressing of this that has this band photo enlarged. The logo looks different, and it actually says featuring Dream On. That's because Dream On was re-released in 1976 and became a hit. This is a very early version of the Aerosmith Wings logo. And if you're like me and of a certain age, these always kind of reminded me of the P-Wings from Super Mario Brothers. Anyway, it smells out Aerosmith. This is a Canadian edition on Columbia. There's a write-up about it. This goes back to very early days of vinyl where they'd actually have a write-up about the group. Tended to do that less and less as the 70s gave way to the 80s. And I don't think this came with much of anything for credits because it was a first album. I'll just show you the record itself was on the typical red Columbia label. Now next up, 1974, good year for me. It was the year I was born. But three of my favorite bands also put out their first albums in 1974. We'll start it off with the very first Rush album. Now this is far from an original pressing, and it's also far from in really good shape. Somebody's got their name, Carl Stairs, August 28, 83. Thank you, Carl, for writing on this. This is a reissue from 1977 when they formed Anthem Records and reissued all of their albums. Of course, this is the one album featuring John Rutsey. And this album's been reissued a few times. This actually doesn't even have a sleeve with it, so at some point I need to replace this. It's just got the blue Anthem logo. The one album that Neil Peart was not on, a good hard rock album and a good start, but not what they would become, obviously. Next up, it's an interesting story because it's not an album I listen to a lot, but it is amazing. Look at that. I mean, how cool is that? The first Kiss album, 1974. Very primitive makeup, not the earliest designs, but the fact is they hadn't quite got it nailed down to what it would be. And this style of photo is usually referred to as Meet the Beatles, because the Beatles did a very similar thing. You can't really see anything from their necks down. If you're a Van Halen fan of all the eras, think of OU812. They did the same thing. Even Queen with the four faces. This is a very popular style because it looks cool. This is a Canadian issue, probably from the late 70s, a Polygram reissue. It was on Casablanca. Now, the reason I say I don't listen to this that much because I don't think it's very well produced and the songs don't really have a lot of power on here, but you can't argue with the songs. Deuce, 100,000 Years, Black Diamond, Strutter, Nothing to Lose, Firehouse, Cold Gin. These are Kiss classics, and they all appear on this first album, so it's pretty hard to argue with that. This is what the version I have looks like on the label. And we're not done with 1974. Another one of my favorite bands, Kansas, put their debut album out in 1974. This is a US edition on Kirshner Records, which is distributed by CBS. And this one actually came with an inner sleeve that had lyrics on it, which is rare for a debut album. So there's all the lyrics and a little bit of credits at the end. Other side of it is just blank. And the logo itself, I like the Kirshner logo because it makes me think Kansas. They're the only act that I have anything on Kirshner Records. I don't think there were a lot. So there you go. That's what the first one looked like. Moving mid-70s now, 1975, a band that started out life very different than what they would become. This is the first Journey album. And you may look at these five guys on the cover and think, I don't see Steve Perry. No, you don't. You won't see him for another 3 years and another 3 albums. This is when they were very much in the prog rock vein. Formed out of the ashes, the original Santana band from Neil Schon and Greg Rowley. These 3 first Journey albums, of them, this is my favorite, and they remain overlooked. As big of a band they are, those first 3 albums remain overlooked, so I keep liking to beat the drum about them. And like all Columbia releases that weren't customized, this is what the label looked like. 1976, another band I continually beat the drum about, and I don't care. People are sick and tired of hearing about it. One of my all-time favorite bands, Y&T, which stands for Yesterday and Today. That's what they went by for their first couple of albums. This came out in 1976. This was one of my rarest. When I found this one, I was very, very excited. I found it back in 1995. Never thought I'd ever locate vinyl copies of the first 2 records. This was on London Records, and very early photo of the band there. A little beat up. I had a cat that got it in my records once. I've never seen a copy of it yet to replace. And somebody named Dale E. Sumner bought this April 4th, 1977, or at least they wrote their name and date on here, but I really don't care because I was just so excited to get this. This is something I found before I had a computer. I was at somebody's house and printed this poster off because I thought it was cool. This is a poster advertising the first Y&T album, so I just printed it off and included it with my copy of the first record. And this is what the record itself looks like on London Records. Also in 1976, kind of an album that doesn't need much of an introduction, and a band that doesn't have a lot of music to talk about. But here's the first Boston album. Now, to me, this one wins hands down on artwork alone. This is just such a cool, I just love this design. Wish I had a huge poster of it. Totally put it up. So this came out in 1976. This is just a US copy. Nothing special about this pressing of it. It's been repressed several times, millions of times probably over the years, because it continues to be a good seller. Although this is an original Epic label, I believe, because Epic would eventually switch to the more familiar blue label. So this orange one is early for them. A couple more to show you. 1977, a band I just recently saw in concert, although there's only one original member left. This is the debut Foreigner album, self-titled on Atlantic Records. This is one of their best albums all the way through. I like Foreigner, but they're not a band that I reach for other than compilations a lot of time, because a lot of times they spend a lot of time on their singles, and the rest of the album, not bad, just kind of sits there. This one is very, very consistent. First of all, first 2 tracks, It Feels Like the First Time and Cold as Ice. This also contains Long, Long Way from Home. Fool for You Anyway, good ballad on here. A little bit of their prog rock side coming out on this one with Star Rider, which Mick Jones sings the most of. Head Knocker's a great rock song. This is a really, really good album. And it too came with a sleeve. So band photos on one side, lyrics on another, and typical red-green Atlantic logo for this one. But finally, once you get much further into the 70s, you talk about debut albums that came out in 1979, you're practically into the 80s. So I'm going to end in 1978 with another album that needs no introduction. It's the first Van Halen album. And I'd just like to say, as an honorable mention, I considered the debut Montrose album, which if you watched the Montrose episode that Matt and I did, that first debut album I just think is one of the best. But it's not like I followed Montrose throughout their career, and it's not like they stayed with that lineup for very long. But that album was kind of the godfather of what this album would be. Ted Templeman produced it. It's got a similar sort of hard rock sound, and you know, you've got a future member of Van Halen on vocals. But let's just talk about this one for now. Not much more to be said about this first Van Halen album. A game-changing album, especially if you were a guitar player at the time. This is a Canadian edition on Warner Brothers. I mean, this band ushered in the 80s. This doesn't look like hardly anything else that came out, even in rock, in 1978. It was so ahead of its time. So the logo on that side of the sleeve, and band photos on that side. And the record itself is just your classic Warner Brothers logo. So there was a lot of other great debut albums that came out in the 70s. Those are 10 of my favorites. What are some of your favorite debut albums that came out in the 1970s? Comment below. I'd be interested to see. Thanks for watching Tim's Vinyl Confessions.